Hello everyone and welcome back. We have been contacted by too many workplaces this year reaching out for support in terms of suicide. So we have to keep talking about this topic. I very much appreciate this is a difficult one for many people, and there will be people speaking about their experiences, so I wanted to let you know. So a reminder at this point that if we do have a timeout room, if you need to go to speak to anyone or to step away. I would like to introduce and welcome back Claire Neal from Mental Health UK as moderator, who will be joined by one of our partners, Helen Matthews from Weber Shandwick, Anita Guru, one of our ambassadors, and Chris Brown from WASP, the Workplace Awareness of Suicide Prevention. Welcome to you all.
Thank you very much, Zoe. And yes, welcome everybody to this session on what employers need to know about suicide. We'll be covering recognising the warning signs, how to ask an employee about suicidal thoughts, suicide policies, and supporting employees impacted by suicide. To reiterate what Zoe said, there will be lived experience stories touched upon, so do be kind to yourself. Make sure you have someone you can speak to after the session if you need it. My colleague Jessie is a mental health first aider and she's available in the timeout room if you'd like to speak to her. Do give yourself some time after the session to process the content, and I wouldn't recommend rushing straight into a meeting afterwards. We'll also be providing some support resources afterwards for you in the chat. Before I introduce the panellists, I wanted to let you know that it is Survivors of Suicide Loss Day on Saturday the 19th of November. Mental Health UK's founding charity is Rethink Mental Illness, and on Friday the 18th of November, Rethink Suicide Bereavement Service is going to be providing free online training workshops for employees about how to support employees bereaved by suicide. Rethink is seeking input from those bereaved by suicide, as lived experience informs all the work we do. So we'll be sharing further details about that after the conference. But without further ado, let me introduce you to our panellists. First of all, we have Chris Brown. Chris is a co-founder of WASP, Workplace Awareness of Suicide Prevention. WASP is a community interest company who support organisations with suicide prevention policies and also campaign for legislative change in this area. Chris also hosts the award-winning podcast, My Argument with Grief. We also have Anita Guru. Anita is a coach, an occupational psychologist and a public speaker on mental health with a background in learning and leadership development spanning almost 20 years. Anita has been on a personal journey with mental illness, where she was diagnosed with complex PTSD during an inpatient stay at a psychiatric hospital. Anita has since been raising awareness around mental health to break the stigma in the workplace, give others hope, and open up the conversation for others who may be struggling. And we also have Helen Matthews. Helen is Chief People Officer at Weber Shandwick, who will be speaking from a workplace perspective about what employers should be looking out for and doing when it comes to suicide awareness, prevention and postvention. So Chris, can I start with you? If you're happy to tell us, what led you to form WASP, and can you tell us more about the work that WASP is leading to help prevent suicide amongst colleagues and wider communities? And if I could ask you to include one key takeaway for delegates today, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, no, thank you very much for inviting me on. Some figures briefly, first of all, just so we've got some context about what we're talking about and the scale of what we're talking about. You may or may not know there are around 6,500 suicides per year in the UK, as 18 a day, if you want to break that down. The leading cause of death for those under the age of 50 is suicide. 70% of victims are in employment, and some occupations are at a particularly high risk. So, for example, construction workers, where the rate is 3 times higher than the national average. So those are some pretty big figures. So it genuinely is the biggest killer of people under 50 in the UK. I often have to repeat that one on these conferences. That should be headline news, right? But it's not. And then what about the hidden figures behind those figures? 1 in 5 people in the UK will have suicidal thoughts at some point. 1 in 20 of those will attempt suicide. Those are some pretty big numbers. Think about the harsh realities of suicide for a moment, what I call the sharp end. For most families, that can be a knock on the door from a nervous young policeman, policewoman, and words spoken that neither of them want to say or hear. Think about what that is doing to families up and down the country every single day. 2 years ago, I got that knock on the door. That was the day my old life ended and my new life began. I wish it hadn't, but here we are. My son, he was 22. He had an exciting life ahead of him, a career just starting, but he couldn't cope. He didn't reach out for help. He couldn't find another door that would open for him. So what did I do? Well, actually, I created a podcast, and to this day, I can't really explain why, but it just seemed the right thing to do. I wanted to reach out to other families to talk to them about how terrible an experience it can be, get them talking. It worked, genuinely. And the podcast then led to WASP. How could I use my knowledge, my experience to make some sort of a difference? Okay, so I'm a management consultant by trade, so I'm supposed to understand workplaces and what makes them work. It was an obvious tie-up for me. So together with 3 other experts in the field, we created WASP, which, as you probably heard, stands for Workplace Awareness of Suicide Prevention. And we set about trying to make ourselves heard. Now, our starting point was these 3 facts. Firstly, there is no requirement for employers to include any reference to suicide prevention or risk mitigation in company policies. Okay. Secondly, death by suicide does not have to be reported to the HSE, even when on company time, company premises, or where work life is a factor. Yeah, we found that shocking when we sat down to talk to the HSE, but that is true. This also means that we end up with very little decent data on suicide in the workplace. Thirdly, crucially, workplaces need support in moving these things forward. Just legislating is not helpful to most companies. So what does WASP do? Well, we campaign to change this legislation and change the HSE rules. We're trying to build a community of organisations that promote suicide awareness, suicide prevention. We're trying to improve the evidence base around workplace suicide, get some better stats. We often go and talk to businesses, to organisations, and online on a daily basis. We provide discussions, webinars, just daily posts aimed predominantly at people responsible for staff welfare. But at the centre of all of this is our rather good template suicide prevention policy. And this can be implemented by any organisation. It's totally free to use. It's been developed over a number of years working with the right experts in this field. We can even help with implementing the policy. We can put you in touch with other companies who've already implemented it. You could just download it for free from our website anytime you want. Now, people often ask me, well, why the workplace? Why the focus there? Good question. But I think I hinted in my earlier stats. It's a common myth that suicide victims are most likely to be out of work, maybe suffering because of that. And it's not true. As I said, 70% have stable jobs, stable income. The importance of the workplace in supporting suicide prevention is only recently being properly realised. Think about it. The workplace for some individuals can be their primary reason for getting up each day, living each day. But it can also be their primary source of stress, anxiety, also maybe their primary source of friendship and support, maybe the only place they go where people talk to them. Now, we believe that the best foundation for suicide prevention is what we might call a holistic approach to health and well-being in the workplace, one that encourages employees to understand its importance and to be open about their concerns and anxieties. What I mean by that is that, well, policies can be a good step in the right direction, but only if you're prepared to resource them, act on them, and make them part of your culture. Culture, that's a great word. We band it around a lot. But, you know, in my experience, healthy teams talk. Really healthy teams talk about lots of things. Life outside of work. Who's going to win the cup? What's going on with our latest corrupt politicians? Who's leaving Strictly this week? But then maybe even more than that. How's your mum? Did you sort out that issue with your gas bill that we talked about? Did you go and see the doctor about that thing? Are you still feeling anxious today? Can I help? management can set the example in terms of talking about it. I've seen the effect on a workplace when a senior manager talks about his experiences or thoughts on suicide. Suddenly everyone thinks it's an okay conversation to have. I train managers in doing this sort of thing. A takeaway? Yeah, thank you for asking that. If you could do one thing after today, my encouragement would be go and see what suicide awareness policies your company has and how they're implemented and communicated and actually put into action. Then, if you want to take it further, come back to WASP and we'll help you go further than that. I'll leave it there. Thank you ever so much.
Chris, thank you. That was so well explained, so engaging, and yeah, there are a few things there that took me by surprise, even working in the field that I do. So thank you so much. I think particularly for me, yeah, the template suicide policy is a brilliant takeaway, and fantastic that you're offering that for free. And I agree, go and have a look at that, because that sounds really, really important. We've got to open up this conversation. Thank you. And now, Nita, if we could move on to you. If you're comfortable to do so, would you tell us a little bit about your own experience of mental illness? And it'd be good to know it'd be helpful to understand how the workplace, whether they recognised what you were going through, and how they could have responded better, what they did well, what they didn't do so well. That would be really useful. And as I asked Chris, if there's a key takeaway, that would be really helpful too.
Thanks, Claire. So as Claire mentioned at the start, I've been on my own journey with mental illness. So I think reflecting back now, I always struggled with my mental health. So anxiety, depression, low mood. But what things really took a turn for the worse back in 2017. Following an ectopic pregnancy, my mental health declined rapidly. I had sort of panic attacks, I had anxiety, low mood, and I was trying to kind of everything I could to help myself feel better, but nothing was working. So I kind of followed my instinct, and I was admitted into a residential care, so into a psychiatric hospital. And it was on admission that my mental health actually deteriorated, and quite soon after I was diagnosed with complex PTSD. And that was something which was, I kind of had a sense that could be happening, but when it being the diagnosis, it made things a lot clearer, and I started to understand myself. So, and with that, my symptoms actually progressed and got a lot worse. And I remember when I entered the sort of hospital, I noticed that there were patients without shoelaces, and I was a bit unsure. But quite soon after I became one of those patients, I was at really high risk of suicide. And a lot of that was entwined with my mental illness, where, you know, I had no hope. I was in consistent pain. I wanted to have a way out from my pain. And with that came with feelings of feeling like a burden. I felt like I was such a burden on my family. You know, they don't deserve this. I'm not worthy. I'm better off if I wasn't here. And those kind of feelings were what stayed with me for some time. And one of the reasons which kept me in there as an inpatient for some time as well. And I was having all sorts of therapy to try and help me. But the thing that it comes back to is that I wanted an exit from my pain. The pain was too much to bear. But you know, when I reached those points, and you know, I had a plan in my mind about how I'm going to change this, what I'm going to do to take action when I feel that way. But there was always this little glimmer of hope that made me hold on. I held on and kept faith, and hope that something will change and things will get better. And what really sticks out in my mind was one particular Sunday afternoon. I was at home for the weekend, and I was in such a bad way. I was fighting myself to not go and act on these urges, and literally sat there fighting my urges, desperately wanting help. And I found the Samaritans. And for me, that was a pivotal moment, and you know, what made a big difference in keeping me on my sofa and not walking away and taking action that day. Because it, you know, 9 years prior, I had a suicide attempt. And I'm here today and I'm telling my story, and now I can think, the things that were making me feel that way, I can see now rationally how I don't need to think that way, but in the depths of the darkness and the grips of my mental health, I couldn't think straight. I couldn't think, actually, just because my family are having to go out their way to take care of me, that doesn't mean that I don't deserve to be here. And I'd say that that's the kind of messages that people who are mentally unwell need to hear. They absolutely deserve to be here. They deserve the help. They deserve to be loved. And it's a temporary feeling, and it will pass and things will get better. And so I worked, had a lot of therapy. I came through it. I was back home. And I can say that, reflecting back from childhood, I had suicidal ideation because of childhood trauma. So that was, again, I'd formed this kind of exit plan in my mind of the pain. Okay, I've got a way out, and it was a way out of the pain. And pain doesn't last forever, and there is hope, and just want everyone to know that. But in terms of the workplace, I was very much keeping everything hidden. I was highly functioning, I was performing, and sadly in a lot of cases there are actually no signs that this is going to happen. But the ways to kind of, I think, get around it, and it's building on what Chris was saying, is have those personal conversations, get to know the people around you. Just because you're at work, you're all still human. Have that human connection, and it's human connections which go a real long way to helping anyone who might be having such thoughts or feel there's no way out. And it kind of opens up the conversation, invites and creates that psychological safety there, where it potentially could open up that they are struggling. So where that managers are having their routine check-ins, gauge what's happening, really tune in. And if your intuition is telling you something, that you might need to ask that question because you know that person's struggling. For me, it's better to ask that question than to not and have regrets. So really trust your instinct, but really know your people. If they're going through a really tough time in their life, having that extra support could really go a long way to reduce them feeling lonely. And it's the loneliness and isolation which can lead to them people believing that they have no other way out. So checking in, referring to employee resources, which might be EAP, but equally for organisations to make it really clear and be explicit about the confidentiality of such resources, because that sometimes is a deterrent where they feel like, oh, my manager might find out, or that know that we're struggling. So it's really important to know that that is confidential. Look out for language and behaviours. If there's a change in your team, if someone, your colleague, think to yourself, okay, what's happening here? And again, that's an opportunity to check in and really genuinely check in. Sometimes you're, oh, how are you? Okay, at the start of a conversation, but then if your intuition is telling you something else, ask again, and do it from a place of empathy and real compassion, and that can really lend itself well to open up the conversation. Training managers, and like Chris was saying, open up the conversations in the workplace, make mental health conversations normalize it so it becomes part of the fabric, part of the culture, and really opening up those conversations so if anyone is struggling, they potentially will come forward and disclose.
Anita, thank you so much. I mean, it's hearing stories like that make these sessions so important, and it doesn't feel there's enough time to kind of to do justice to what you've just said, but I know that what you have shared will help other people, and you're quite right, we have to talk about it. We can't shy away from the word suicide and the conversations. So really massive thank you for sharing that. And then Helen, moving on to you to continue this workplace perspective. So we know that every life lost to suicide has a ripple effect and has a much bigger impact on those around that individual. It would be great to understand from you how senior leadership teams can build awareness and break down taboos around speaking about suicide in the workplace. And if you have one key takeaway, that would be great to hear as well.
Yeah, I think to use the language that's already been used, it's about opening up that conversation and really meaning it. And something Anita just said about listening, I think so often we talk about listening cultures and we talk about listening skills, but that proper deep level of listening to your people it's just so important for line managers, but also for leaders. I think that signalling, really does need to come from the very top, that openness around conversation and reassuring people that it's okay not to be okay. So leaders really do set that tone. I think using the activation days, such as World Suicide Prevention Day, you know, as long as the activation is meaningful and isn't ticking a box, then again, it can just open up those conversations and it can mean that the conversation stays live. And I think that that's often what's so important, is that it doesn't feel as though we've talked about this once this year, so we're not talking about it again. And again, you know, where people in the workplace, where we've lost people to suicide, then it's about making sure that all of the colleagues feel supported, able, even practical things, able to attend the funeral, able to really be able to celebrate or to mourn that person, and to not just be sweeping it under the carpet. So I think that's where leadership plays such a strong role. And as I say, in the weeks and months after, to just keep that dialogue open, and really remembering to check in on each other, but with that proper actual listening.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really important. It's remembering, and anniversaries are key dates. And I think, yeah, it has to be something that listening and being authentic. I mean, to pick up on some of the key takeaways, human connection, authenticity, bringing our real selves into the workplace so that we know our employees, as you say, Chris, we really know them, and aren't afraid to ask those sensitive questions, because if we don't, we could miss signs, and we're not giving permission then to the individuals to know it's a safe space to ask for help when help is needed. So we have got some questions that have come in. Before I move on, I just want to say huge thank you to all of you. It's so brave to share stories, but it's so powerful. We can talk about policies and procedures and what we should do, but when you hear a real story, it touches the heart, and it makes it very real. So thank you so much. We can't shy away from these conversations. We know that talking about it saves lives, so just a massive thank you. And I'm going to, some of the questions that have come up. First one's an easy one, which I'll just quickly answer. Someone wants to be reminded of the podcast that Chris has talked about, and it is My Argument with Grief. So that was an easy one. So I'll open this up to any of you. Do we need legislation for organisations to be more open about suicide data? I think this might be one for you, Chris. Are there potential legal issues that prevent organisations from doing so? Do you know that?
No, funny enough, there is not much legislation that will prevent them from tracking simple data, apart from your obvious legislation around keeping personal data. The problem we have is, firstly, legislation is a big stick to break a lot of things with, and we need to be careful about saying legislation is the answer to everything. There are simpler things that we just need to achieve as a society. But what I was hinting at earlier was the simple fact that the HSE themselves do not insist on suicides being reported, even if they happen in the workplace. Even if the coroner decides that the workplace was a significant factor, they are not recorded by the HSE. And I think what we all need to be doing is pushing for that level of change, which does not need legislation, by the way. The HSE does not work fully off legislation. We talk to them on a regular basis. There is actually a petition on the government petitions page at the moment to get that discussed in Parliament. I could provide the link after this, because I wouldn't be able to reel that off the top of my head, but there is one going through at the moment to try and make those changes with the HSE. And if we make those changes, then all of a sudden we start to get decent data through about number of suicides in the workplace, what sort of workplace environments they're happening in, what maybe time of day, during work, after work, whatever, we start to get some decent data, which really informs the change that we're trying to make.
Brilliant. A really comprehensive answer, thank you. And yeah, it'd be great to have a link to that petition, because I think there'll be a lot of people on this call today who will want to take some actions. Okay, moving on to the next question, and bear with me because I'm reading them first time. So someone has asked, I would like to ask what the panel consider to be an appropriate level of support and duty of care for employees with suicidal thoughts. As a GP doing mental health risk assessments and getting urgent support in place for people with suicidal thoughts regularly, this is something I feel very comfortable to do, but it's something I've been highly trained in and it's well within my professional scope. What's the appropriate role for the employer here? Is it signposting and removal of stigma, or is there more than that? Is there anyone who'd like to respond?
I think it's a really good question, because I think, you know, we've had many conversations around the role of mental health first aiders, for example. I think those who aren't trained need to be super careful. So as employers, I think we've absolutely got a duty of care to make sure our managers are trained, make sure our leaders are trained, and to be able to sort of respond appropriately. But I do think there's a fine line between taking on something that you're not trained in. If you're not a trained medical professional, that's where signposting, etc., becomes really important. So that I feel quite strongly about that. I think we need to make sure that people aren't trying to do something, maybe make an intervention that isn't potentially the right intervention. So I think we need to be clear on roles.
Absolutely. And just to add something from my side, I would say, yeah, boundaries are absolutely key. And in response to the person who asked the question, it is about being able to ask the question, to provide a supportive response, and to signpost appropriately and follow up. You know, line managers get an awful lot of pressure to do all of this stuff around mental health, but they're not counsellors. And one thing that we say that line managers should never say, call me whenever you want, which can be very hard for line managers, because a lot of them do care, a huge amount of them do care, but I think those boundaries are really important, because you've got to look after yourself first, and you're not responsible for that person's life. You can do your bit, but it's not on you. And I think, yeah, really important.
Can I just add that the Zero Suicide Alliance, ZSA, provides some very good free basic training in suicide awareness. Within that is the setting of boundaries and what is the right approach according to your level of training. And I would encourage anyone to take on the free modules whenever they find themselves with some time to spare.
Great tip, Chris. And there's one last question. So timing wise, we're down to the last 2 minutes. So let's try and get this one in. Earlier, we were talking about how interventions should be person-centred, but I think there are examples here of where that would add incredible pressure to people who are struggling and perhaps don't know what the best route forward is. How can we tell the difference? Just trying to make sure I understand. So intervention should be person-centred. How can we tell the difference? I'm not sure that I understand the question, actually. Let me just read that again, sorry. This person thinks that there are examples here of where person-centred interventions would add incredible pressure to people who are struggling. I'm not sure. I think we may have covered this in as far as the line manager's response. It should be person-centred, but they shouldn't take the sole responsibility. And I will also add, if you are a manager and somebody is talking to you about suicide, do get support for yourself. I talked about this responsibility, and it's not solely yours, and you need support as well. So I hope that's done justice. I'm not sure if I answered that correctly. If anyone's got anything to add before we close the session. No, Doesn't look like it. Well, look, it just leaves me to say massive thank you. As we've said throughout this session, there are several resources that we can all share, and I know this can happen. We'll be sending out some information to you all. To reiterate, Jessie, our mental health first aider, is in the timeout room, so there should be a timeout section on the taskbar. Do feel free to do that, but also do take some time to decompress and process what's been talked about today. And finally, just thank you so much, Helen, Chris and Anita, for being so generous with everything you've shared today. It's been really good.
Thank you.
Yes, and followed up by another thank you from me. Thank you, Helen, to you for giving that workplace perspective, and special thanks to Chris and Anita. There has been many thanks to you in the chat box for both of your vulnerabilities, so thank you so much for sharing with us. We have a few minutes now until the next session, so please do take some time. Our next session will be about faith, culture and mental health at work, so we'll see you then.